Welcome to another episode of Athens and Jerusalem. Let's begin where we can't escape. Let's begin with Logos.
Now, I would say that this openness, this being in the world, this referring to the world, to objects in the world, what I would like to call self-transcendence, this is disappearing as soon as you project a human being into a lower dimension than its own dimension.
Point of the V goes up to the nuclear explosion that created it.
Tell me this, Dr. Oppenheimer. Do you ever become frightened at what you're finding out here in this area that can't be measured in either time or space?
You see, that's a real point.
Do not be afraid. Open your hearts, open up your hearts.
Open up your hearts to Athens and Jerusalem, the infants of our culture, united, independent, polarized, and even bloody. Athens, the cradle of wisdom and rationality. Jerusalem, the cradle of faith and spirituality. In this podcast, we look at reunion. Could reason be more than modern secular skepticism? And could spirituality be more than belief? So welcome to another episode of the Athens and Jerusalem podcast. And in this episode, we have with us Professor in Philosophy, Roe Fremstedal. Welcome.
Thank you.
And you are an expert on Kierkegaard, Søren Kierkegaard, the Danish philosopher. And I know this is something that we have been exciting for a long time, because he is one of those last philosophers in many ways that have really focused on, what I would say is the distinction between revelation and knowledge. I don't think we could say rationality, because I think revelation is part of rationality in this sense, but that's something we can discuss further. So Roe, how would you, if you should try to explain very simple Kierkegaard's understanding of this distinction between knowledge and revelation?
Yeah, thank you. First off, I'm tempted to make a slightly historical introduction. So basically, you could say that in Germany and in Denmark, usually these questions were framed as the relation between human knowledge on the one hand, and specifically religious faith on the other hand. They did use the same term, though, for religious faith and all kinds of beliefs. So there's the same term. But usually there's a contrast between human knowledge and human rationality as a faculty, and this gets separated from supernatural revelation, usually by focusing on Christianity, but you could equally focus on Judaism or Islam. Kierkegaard's contemporaries usually only discuss Christianity. And you could say that Kierkegaard became infamous for saying that religious faith was absurd and paradoxical. This is well known from Fear and Trembling and Concluding Unscientific Postscript. And the immediate effect of this was that there was a big controversy in Denmark over the relationship between religious faith and knowledge. And so usually people understood Kierkegaard as saying that religious faith is irrational or absurd or paradoxical. I think this is a complete misunderstanding, but at least that's how it got sort of picked up. And the whole thing started with a big public controversy, basically. And then it took almost 50 years before he got a big international breakthrough, mostly on the continent, the European continent.
Because what we're talking about now is more like what is what has been discussed, but I think we should try to like give some important understanding of his philosophy in this on this topic.
Yeah, thank you. So the whole thing is a bit complicated, but you could say that, like Kant and many others, Kierkegaard repeatedly contrasts belief or faith with knowledge. And so he does argue that knowledge requires sufficient evidence or conclusive evidence. Often this is spelled out in terms of certainty. And here's the confusing thing. Belief, by contrast, requires a lack of evidence, and it also requires a lack of counter-evidence. So something is not settled epistemically, and then it's often the case that it's not a good idea to be neutral or agnostic or to suspend belief. So Kierkegaard is particularly concerned with cases where you lack sufficient epistemic evidence, and still being an agnostic or suspending belief is not a good option. So he's basically concerned with the things that we know from, I guess, from William James and also from Kant. So cases where you need to take a stand, despite the fact that you don't have any firm ground epistemically. You don't have any sufficient evidence. And this is the problem that concerns Kierkegaard, and he knew this from the German context, from Kant. And in Kant, the important text is the canon of pure reason in the critique of pure reason, basically, where Kant explains that you need to deny knowledge to make room for belief, and these are technical notions. Yeah.
Because what is important now is to understand that this is absolutely not the young Wittgenstein who says that the questions we can't give a evidential answer on, we shouldn't even ask. This is a philosophy where we actually we think that these kind of question is something that is necessarily part of human existence.
Yeah, well, he seems to be making a broadly Kantian point. So the basic assumption seems to be that there are cognitive limitations such that there are important ethical and religious matters where you cannot possibly have sufficient epistemic evidence. And on the other hand, sometimes you need to make a stand. So the alternative to belief seems to be, in many cases, incoherence or something that usually spells out in terms of despair, in terms of being double-minded or incoherent in your thinking.
But could we say that the more important the question is for human existence, the more difficult it is to have evidence on it?
I'm not sure if we could sort of generalize it completely, but the thing is that he usually makes this point only in a sort of moral and religious context. So this idea that you need belief, not knowledge, and it seems to be saying that people are too preoccupied with knowledge. People think that knowledge is more important than belief, but he seems to be saying that it's just opposite. But almost all of these points only apply in moral and religious contexts. And in scientific contexts, it looks different. And it also looks different in a lot of everyday contexts. So typically, Kierkegaard's central points only hold if you lack evidence and you need to take a stand.
It sounds like it's just me and you, Roe, that is in the meeting today, but we have Cameron and Stephen with us.
Yeah, I'm just trying to sort of think of a point of entry into this, because it seems that this kind of dichotomization is not really, to my mind, well justified. And I think that we find that indeed religious or other similar kind of metaphysical belief systems, if they're totally cut off from rational thinking, can become, well, anything from superstition to how would I say, well-developed fantasy. But at the same time, I think we have also seen that the Enlightenment ambition that we could sort of do away with anything metaphysical, and that, you know, knowledge on its own and rationality on its own, without ethical or even metaphysical existential perspectives to support it or to give it some sort of direction, can become almost like an autoimmune disease. It can turn against ourselves. We can misuse that knowledge, especially in terms of technology. So it would seem to me that these two things, metaphysics and rationality, sort of require each other, and that's why I find this theme of integrating Athens and Jerusalem an important one in today's world, because I think it's quite obvious that one without the other is not really functional. But I don't know. I mean, maybe there are other, and I'm sure there are other viewpoints to this matter. But I wonder whether Kierkegaard can help us better understand the relationship between Athens and Jerusalem, and like the conditions within which the two could interact and integrate in a more how to say, fruitful and successful way than thus far has been the case.
I was hoping, Roe, that you have a comment on this.
Yeah, so just a clarification. So I think we're in sort of broad agreement on metaphysics. So you cannot easily escape metaphysics, and trying to escape metaphysics often results in bad metaphysical assumptions that are sort of obscure and hidden and so on. And in Kierkegaard studies, you've seen a lot of renewed interest in metaphysics recently, usually sort of combined with various discussions of realism, and especially in metaethics and theology. But the other point, I think, I'm not sure if we disagree, but I don't think Kierkegaard really says that religious belief or even Christianity is cut off from rational thinking. I know a lot of people sort of read Kierkegaard that way. So it was basically this contrast between the paradox, the absurdity of religious belief that gave people the assumption that somehow religious belief is not subject to rational examination and so on. But the point I was making is different. So I'm only saying that it's not something that only concerns theoretical or epistemical, merely intellectual issues. So it's not just about cognition. Theoretically, it's not just about epistemic evidence. There are also practical considerations, practical reasons. And so, in a sense, you could say that, yes, perhaps religious belief exceeds theoretical thinking, it exceeds epistemic evidence and so on. But it doesn't follow that there's no rationality involved, because a lot of it actually concerns practical rationality, practical reasons. And there is also a very interesting point made these days by Kierkegaardians who work within epistemic permissivism. So they try to show the various ways in which epistemic concerns and practical concerns actually interact. And so you'll find quite a bit of this in Kierkegaard as well.
Because of course, for me, it seems very strange to think that all kind of belief or metaphysical thinking should be just on equal level of what we can logical or rational understand. That of course, there are some assumptions we have, even though we can't prove them as we do with knowledge, it's still, some of them seems to be more evidential than others.
Yes, it depends a bit on what you mean by evidence. So the problem there is that people tend to take the term in different senses. So I'm only using it in a sort of philosophical sense of anything that gives you a reason to believe something. Some people use it in different ways. They, for instance, follow medicine. I think you need specific methods or something like that. But that's different from the usage I'm following here. And so, at least on my reading, Kierkegaard is not claiming that religious belief is irrational or something like that. He's basically saying that there are principled limitations on our understanding. We cannot understand the supernatural as such, for instance. We cannot understand the infinite as such. But it doesn't follow that from cognitive limitations that religious belief cannot be justified, even though it cannot be fully explained or comprehended. Yeah. And so there are different senses of rationality, and also when you talk about reason, sometimes you mean specifically the faculty of reason. Yeah. And so basically, since the medieval, since the scholastics and so on, Western thinkers have agreed that supernatural revelation differs from natural standards, such as human reason, right? And Kierkegaard actually follows on this. He doesn't break with this tradition at all. He sort of accepts it. And that's why he distinguishes between different types of religious belief, something that's specifically Christian, something types that are not. Yeah. And you'll find this in a number of different works. Yeah.
But if they are not, does that mean that they are like universal? That
Yeah. So basically, what you'll find in Kierkegaard is at least 3 different variants. There is something I would call natural religion that doesn't rest on supernatural revelation. And then there's Judaism, which does require supernatural revelation, and Christianity. Those are the 3 types that Kierkegaard discusses the most. Yeah. And so the difficulty in the literature has been to how to make sense of Kierkegaard's talk of natural religion, because it's clear that Kierkegaard doesn't accept theistic proofs. Kierkegaard accepts Kant's criticism of theoretical proofs, and many people sort of got this misunderstanding from bad courses in the history of modern philosophy that after Hume and Kant, natural theology sort of disappeared. And it's not true at all. So in Kant, for instance, if you look at, for instance, the lectures on the philosophical doctrine of religion written in the 1780s, held in the 1780s, it's very clear that Kant says that natural theology is wrong, understood as a merely sort of epistemic or theoretical endeavor. But if we interpret it differently, if we interpret it in more broadly moral and practical terms, then it makes perfect sense. So Kant actually says that natural theology shouldn't be understood as something that only concerns belief, understood epistemically, intellectually. It's more a practical matter. So it belongs to practical philosophy for Kant. And so what I'm been arguing in a couple of books is that basically Kierkegaard follows Kant in this regard.
could you just, before, I know that Stephen is probably eager to say something, but before, could you just give us an example of what is natural theology?
So the best known examples would be the theistic proofs, like the cosmological proof or the ontological proof and so on. And Kant, of course, does reject those proofs in the Critique of Practical Reason. However, he introduces a new moral proof instead. So Kant argues that the alternative to religious belief is immorality. So you need to be a Bösewicht, so a scoundrel, unless you believe. That's Kant's argument. So Alan Wood and others have been writing about this. So basically, Kant is making some kind of reductio where he tries to show that non-belief involves practical problems. So it's not acceptable practically. That's how the argument goes. Yeah.
So in thinking about Kierkegaard, my starting point would be the promise of the Enlightenment, which I see Kierkegaard and Kant and Wittgenstein, all these others that we've already mentioned, as in a way responding to. And this promise of the Enlightenment is that through purely the exercise of reason, limiting our conversations about what we can observe, about what we can rationally prove, what we can use the scientific method to uncover, that we can overcome otherwise irreconcilable differences between religion, between personal belief systems and so forth, and come to some sort of collective consensus about what is true and move forward on that basis. And that being sort of the kind of, let's say, the promise of the Enlightenment, which has had certain undeniably useful and powerful effects in the world. We have people like Kant and Kierkegaard who are not satisfied that the rational description of the universe is complete and sufficient. Kant, in his own way, makes room for the non-rational through his theory of things in themselves that that reason can't touch. Kierkegaard, in his own way, is also making room for the non-rational through his theory of this this gap between the that has to be bridged through a kind of leap of faith. And I guess my question would be, on an individual level, I can really sympathize with Kierkegaard and see the power of this thinking. But my question is regarding, if everyone makes their own leap of faith, then my leap of faith isn't necessarily going to be the same as your leap of faith. How can this become a basis for the reconciliation of the very real problems that exist in the world today between different religious systems, between different sort of philosophical mindsets? And it seems to me that humanity is facing this kind of existential problem of how do we bridge gaps? And how does a philosophy that so emphasizes the individual component of spiritual faith as being a kind of sacred space that reason can't intrude on, how can that become a basis for the bridging of gaps?
Well, that's not one question, but a series of questions, right? And first, yes. I would like to note that there's no such thing as a leap of faith in Kierkegaard. So the whole thing sort of was invented 100 years after his death by translators. And so the leap of faith is a myth. It's not to be found in the primary text. The interesting thing, though, is a justificatory one, right? About justification of religious belief. And so I'm not saying that he's a subjectivist or a relativist or anything like that. Rather, it's some kind of realist who believes in truth. And so the question is really about what could justify religious belief. So it's perfectly clear from the literature, it cannot possibly be epistemic evidence if Kierkegaard is right or Kant is right. Kierkegaard is not taking seriously this conservative idea that traditional beliefs could be justified just by being traditional beliefs. He doesn't really pursue this kind of conservatism, epistemic conservatism either, right? And then there's only two options left, basically. You could be a pragmatist regarding belief who say that it's practical reasons who justify belief, and for Kierkegaard, it's basically moral reasons, right? And since he's a moral realist, basically, it's a shared moral truth. Yeah. And so that's the pragmatist reading of Kierkegaard, which I've been defending. And then there's a fourth and final option, which is fideism, which is roughly the view that somehow belief could justify itself. It could be self-constituting in some kind of sense. And so often this idea is attributed to Kierkegaard, but it's not very sort of clear, or it's not separated well from the alternative readings. So it's not too clear what to make of it, and its normative standing is not clear either. But a lot of it seems to boil down to this idea that perhaps there is something special with divine revelation. Perhaps it just happens to be that God's revelation could somehow justify itself. So we don't have any sort of external standard to hold up against divine revelation. So Kant, for instance, says that our reason is the standard by which to judge divine revelation. Kierkegaard seems to deny this, and then people seem to say that, oh, then he's a fideist. But what does fideist mean? The problem is that the term is used very loosely in a very sort of derogative manner, and it basically means any kind of view that sort of contrasts faith and reason. And that doesn't really work. You need to be much more precise than this. And so I've been interested in sort of developing and defending this pragmatist reading as a sort of clear alternative. Yeah.
So if I understand you correctly, what this fideism would be like if you understand faith or belief as something completely irrational, then you would have like ending up in this position.
Well, it's not irrational in the sense that it's not justified. It's really about justification here of how to justify religious belief, right? So you need to be clear what's the sense of irrational here. And if you go into this, you'll find that it's not very clear at all, basically. So fideism is not the view that religious belief or faith is irrational. Rather, it's the view that it's justified despite a lack of evidence, despite a lack of practical reasons that justifies this, despite conservative justifications. And so there has to be something self-constituting that sort of accounts for this unique feature that the faith has. That's roughly the picture. But once you look into it, often it's very vague and it's difficult to make sense of. And in Kierkegaard, most of it has to do with some circularity, how to account for divine revelation. So basically, Kierkegaard is saying that either you speak from the perspective of divine revelation or you do not. And then if you take up this sort of dichotomy, right, then it's difficult to sort of justify the transition from the natural standpoint that doesn't rely on divine revelation, and then suddenly you get the leap into specifically religious revelation. Yeah, and so that's the problem, and the problem is described in concluding unscientific postscript as a leap, but not as a leap of faith, though. It's yeah.
Which divine revelation? What would Kant say today to the multiplicity of religious faiths that are all sort of rubbing up against each other? Islam, for one, which is a cousin to Christianity and Judaism, but beyond that, what about Hinduism and Buddhism? These are their own kind of self-sustaining circular arguments of their own.
Yeah, you could say that if you work in philosophy or religion, most of the literature on this issue is very recent. There's only in last decades we've seen good work on this. And a lot of the sort of traditional work is great in other respects, but very sort of disappointing in this respect. And so one of the things you found recently is that if you take faith in this very basic sense of trust, of trusting a person, a personal God or something like that, if you focus on that and not on the doctrinal content or the propositional content of faith, then suddenly we could be, Christians could qualify, Jews could qualify, and so on, right? So in this respect, it's very difficult to find anything that excludes anyone. And in the Christian theology, usually they will say that in the Gospels, if you look into the Greek term for faith, pistis, usually, then it's not clear that it refers much to any doctrinal content at all. So it's only much later, when you get to Nicaea in 325, that you get quarrels about dogma. But this is really a response to a political situation almost out of control, where you have conflicts in different groups. And so to try to solve this practical issue, political issue, then you respond by introducing dogma, such as the incarnation, right? And so what people differ on is on the doctrinal content, right? On the propositional content. And basically, there are different views that cannot all be true simultaneously. So that's where the problem arises. But a lot of the sort of theologians here would be, at least they would sort of accept people as genuine believers and as being potentially saved, even though your doctrinal beliefs are not perfect at all. And so in this sense, you could be somewhat hopeful, I guess. In other ways, perhaps not, but yeah. Yeah.
Of course, this is also then we start to have this distinction between, I mean, those who believes and those who don't believe. Or
Yeah.
is it even possible to not be a believer?
Well, Kierkegaard does make the very strange and strong claim that it's somehow impossible to not believe. Unfortunately, no one has really reconstrued how this argument is supposed to go. The closest we get is some recent scholarship, which is independent of Kierkegaard, but it does also refer to Kierkegaard. So there are the ideas that you could believe in God de re, but not in God de dicto. So basically, by relating to something that's divine and good, so for instance, by having the virtues, being good and so on, by loving your neighbor, doing charity work, whatever, then you're relating to God de re, even though you don't have any doctrinal beliefs. You don't have any sort of de dicto content, like the incarnation and so on. And so in this sense, it seems that if you accept especially some kind of realism, where there is a truth you cannot escape, and it's only about how to relate to it, that there's some room for defending some kind of view like this, basically. Yeah. So this has been developed recently by Paul Moser and C. Stephen Evans recently, in at least several books. Yeah.
Yeah, but because we also have like for me when I'm reading Kierkegaard, I think there is still some kind of lifestyle that is maybe even without any kind of belief at all. Or I mean, in his first writing, when he distinguished between an ethical and an aesthetical lifestyle or way of life, could we say that the aesthetical way of life is a non-believer's way of life?
So basically, I think that the issue here is that belief is such a sort of basic term that it covers a lot of different sort of states, and also a lot of different dispositions and even virtues and so on. And so basically, there are many beliefs we have that are not religious beliefs. And so Johannes the Seducer does have beliefs about the girl he's going to seduce and so on. It's just not the kind of belief we're interested in here, I guess. That's my hunch at least, yeah.
So you would say that an aesthetical lifestyle is a non-believing lifestyle?
No, there are, I mean, if you want to say what an aesthete is, you need to spell out its contents, and you do that by specifying various beliefs. So, such as the idea that you could avoid moral commitment or something like that, right? Or avoid moral motivation or whatever. Different ways of spelling out, but typically those involve beliefs. And there are some specific issues with Christian beliefs, because belief is supposed to be a virtue, a theological virtue. It's supposed to be a gift. You're not supposed to acquire it on your own and so on. So that's kind of different, right? And it's different from the everyday beliefs. And it's not just a sort of episodical thing. It's supposed to be a virtue that involves dispositions, right? And it's supposed to go together with hope and charity as the other theological virtues. And so that's different, but it's also interesting. And one of the problems in the literature is that a lot of the existentialist readings of Kierkegaard sort of completely obscure this virtue theory, where belief and other things are not episodic stuff. It's more about dispositions, habits, and virtues that are more or less stable, right?
As opposite to this, to really to take a stand, you mean?
Sorry, I'm not sure if I got that. Sorry.
No, I'm not sure if I'm following you correctly, but because Kierkegaard is very like when it comes to belief,
yeah,
we as a human being, we have to take stand. We have to like decide.
Yes.
But could we, when we are understanding this faith as something that we are just being received from somewhere else or from God or something, it's like, is this not the same, or could you take a stand and at the same time feel that this is coming from outside yourself?
Yeah. So basically, now we're getting into very traditional theology, right? We're getting into soteriology, the doctrine of justification, right? And so Kierkegaard is absolutely clear that predestination is an ugly view. Basically, God cannot, on his view, condemn some of us and save others. He's arguing that religious belief has to be a gift that you can accept or not. So you do have the power to say no. And so in this sense, human agency is decisive. You're free not to believe in the sort of Christian sense. So he's absolutely clear about that.
Because I think that makes sense for me, because this is also about subjectivity. Because in nowadays, we have this strange understanding of subjectivity as like something even individual or unique for every one of us, like we are private or even solipsistic. But how I read both Kant and Kierkegaard, there is like this sensus communis understanding of reason and rationality, that this is not something, when you are taking this stance, when you're making your choices, they are not based on your private understanding, but it is based on like a common rationality.
Yeah, so I guess I'm in basic agreement. So the easiest way to make this point is to say that properly understood, reasoning is a shared activity. So to reason well, you need to be able to understand others and to trust them and to respect their views and to have some understanding of the reasons they offer. You need to be able to learn from them and so on. So basically, reasoning doesn't function well if you try to isolate yourself from the views of others. And confusingly, Kierkegaard does make this very point in Fear and Trembling and also in the book of Adler. And so this is a bit confusing because both Abraham in Fear and Trembling and Adler in the book on Adler, both of them are sort of isolated individuals, isolated religious believers. And in the case of Adler, Kierkegaard is very explicit that it's because he's isolated that he becomes mad, and that he's irrational and you cannot really trust what he's saying. The case of Abraham is different, and that has confused a lot of people. And so Kierkegaard is there introducing this idea of a private revelation.
Now, this is, of course, very interesting to know that this idea about the private are starting in this time. Cameron, you had a question, or you were trying to say something, and we interrupted
Well,
you.
no. But I mean, I was just thinking, because I just happened to come across again after, I don't know, 30 years or so, across the talk that Alexander Solzhenitsyn gave in, I think, at Princeton University in America, or no, maybe it was Harvard, actually. Doesn't matter. Anyway, after having been in America for a year, he gave this talk where he criticized Western humanism. And his point was, I think, similar to the one that Stephen was raising about the possibility of bridging gaps. I mean, because he was saying that, okay, so the idea of humanism is that human beings, quite sort of independent of any superhuman entity, power, intelligence, whatever you want to call it, subjectively decide what is good and bad, and he didn't see that as being able to lead to anything that could be bridging gaps or even giving some sort of even in a pragmatic sense, a good point of departure for finding out what is good for human beings to do. And I think that problem is very visible in the world today. I mean, if you look at what's happening around the globe, I mean, there are all kinds of people engaged in it, and some of them are supposedly very religious people. But I mean, there seems not to be any kind of a clear idea of how we should be thinking or behaving towards each other, or at least there doesn't seem to be anything right now that would somehow oblige us to do things in a certain way. And this kind of morality based on pragmatism right now, anyway, seems to play to the tune of those who have power. So those who are more powerful can decide what is right or what is possible for people to do. So I'm just wondering if there's, if we can find some sort of a resolution to this kind of problem. I mean, this whole issue of, can there be real meaningful morality or ethics without presupposing something that at least some of us would call God? I mean, it's sort of a humanistic morality, something that can bring humanity together and give us a future where we can all thrive together.
I'll piggyback on that, and I guess in part restate my earlier question, which is something to do with what is our reference point to the truth. If we're all living individually, we don't really need to worry about whether there's some collective reference point to the truth, because we can each have our own truth and live that truth.
Mm-hmm.
But we don't have the luxury of doing that in today's interconnected world, neither as individuals nor as nations, nor as belief systems or religions. We are forced to find, whether on some pragmatic dimension or in some transcendental dimension, something that can give us a collective reference point. And the scientific method and the Enlightenment kind of dangled before us the promise that if we can cut away all the metaphysical baggage, we can at least come to some collective consensus over what is real, by confining our conversation to things that we can measure and agree about. whereas Kierkegaard's, the focus is on, the opposite of that. His focus is on precisely that dimension of human experience that is not quantifiable, that two people will not necessarily agree on when they talk about it. And I guess it kind of begs the question of, and I don't want to like make Kierkegaard do more work than he himself was trying to do. I'm trying to make him to be the solver of today's world problems, because maybe that wasn't his plan. But when you confine your sort of discussion about these matters of ultimate consequence to an individual encounter with the divine, and how that may or may not be self-justifying, or may not be rational, or may not involve a leap of faith, how are we going to extend whatever benefit we get from, say, Kierkegaard's philosophy to all of humanity? How can we move from individual justification of faith to a future state where all of humanity can somehow participate in something that they collectively agree is transcendent, that somehow affirms the individual differences, that people are always going to have different ways of relating to the divine, but at the same time provides a strong enough foundation for collective action and for bridging of these differences? Again, I'm asking like 10 questions at once, but
yeah, or 20, but okay. So let me try. So first off, I think that the sort of widespread view of Kierkegaard as some kind of subjectivist, individualist, and relativist, and so on, I think that's basically mistaken. So one of the slogans he uses is subjective truth. It doesn't mean that you create your own truth, or what is true for you is not true for me, or anything like that. It describes a way of living truthfully by following independent standards that he takes to be moral and religious. And so basically, I'm saying that Kierkegaard is much more of a realist metaphysically. And so it's not science that will give you what is real. It's philosophy and metaphysics and metaethics that will give you what is real, right? And even science is not enough. Even the activity of doing science requires ethics and requires a human society, right? And so Kierkegaard doesn't have much of a problem with science, but it's more concerned with morality and with religion. And so basically he's saying that you can only be mistaken if there's a standard that you're mistaken about. So he is a realist about truth. And so there are questions to be raised about practical issues, moral issues, right? So you can criticize someone because they're not living up to moral standards. Similarly, you can criticize someone who's not living up to theoretical standards in science or elsewhere. But basically, I'm rejecting this picture of Kierkegaard as a subjectivist and relativist, basically. And so he's much more a Christian Platonist on my reading, basically. Yeah.
So if he does ultimately argue that there are objective moral truths, and that could at least theoretically form a basis for, let's say, larger human unity, then, well, can we write those objective truths down? Are they unchangeable over time? What about things like who you can marry? That older religions have a definite stance on, that in modern times we've come to question. What would Kierkegaard's position be to that kind of malleability or evolutionary character of moral thinking and what's right and wrong?
Yeah.
How do we deal with that?
So basically, he's not much interested at all in specifying which acts are moral and which acts are immoral. So it's much more concerned with virtues that are moral and Christian, basically. So specifically, he's concerned with hope, charity, and faith, right? And he does stress the changelessness of God. So this is a sort of slightly controversial view in Christian theology, but it does hold a fairly Platonic view of God as being not subject to change, right? But there are some other elements that might sort of well, challenge some of this. So basically, he's saying that he's kind of open to this idea that there could be individual callings. So it may not be that you could have general principles that for all action and so on, for ways of living and so on. There could be individual callings. And so he's very open to this, and he builds on a lot of the Christian tradition is also open to this. And you'll find this today, for instance, in divine command ethics. Yeah.
So if I understand you correctly, or you will say that about he will not be interested in dogmas, or like.
No, I wasn't really rejecting dogmas. I was more saying that ethics is not so much about individual acts and episodes as about virtues and character traits, right? So this is a point about moral psychology to a large extent. So Kierkegaard is really concerned with human character, moral character, and with the virtues. That's his focus. When it comes to dogma, he's fairly clear that natural religion doesn't require any specific dogmas. You could be very vague and unclear about the doctrinal commitments, and yet you could have some kind of natural religion on Kierkegaard's view. But it does say that Christianity does require some dogmas, some that to be determinate. Some dogmas are required. So this is spelled out very clearly in the book on Adler, and it's been stressed recently by Paul Moser. And you can only sort of criticize someone for getting Christianity wrong if you're able to spell out some of the dogma, like the dogma of the incarnation and so on. And so for Kierkegaard, a lot of it really has to do with the incarnation. And so he's really following the traditional Christology of Nicaea and yeah. So it's very orthodox. Yeah.
So if I understand you correctly, and based on what you have said now, I think that I understand Kierkegaard more, in your view, as a moral philosopher, and then of course that he's, and of course he started to write really as a young man, and he was like trying to find his own path in life, his way of living, and this was of course important for him, and I think that's also why often young boys are very like to read Kierkegaard, but then maybe we could say in a way that he would say that a good life, I mean a moral life, is a more valued, a life that he would prefer to have, compared to, let's say, a knowledgeable life. I mean, by education or by getting into some kind of power job.
Yeah, like Kant and many others, Kierkegaard would often sort of contrast a good, happy life with a moral life. And so that's one of the difficulties. So it's not the case that having the moral virtues will guarantee happiness. So in this sense, Kierkegaard is absolutely not a Stoic, right? And it's also basically saying that you could have moral requirements independently of personal happiness, independent of prudential reasons, basically. So in this sense, it's very much a modern thinker, and very much a post-Kantian thinker. And he sort of attacks especially Aristotle for confusing morality with prudence and so on, and for being overly egoistic, basically. So Kierkegaard follows the Kantians in using eudaimonism as a term for egoism. Yeah.
But just to make me clear, because when I was talking about the good life, it was more in a Platonic sense of good.
Okay, yeah.
And of course, that's not the same as happiness, as Aristotelian sense of life.
No. No.
But generally, I think that the challenge and the issue in today's world is that, and I think Christianity perhaps more than the other Abrahamic religions has been understood and interpreted most often as a sort of a personal thing, experiencing personal salvation. It's you and God, and of course it does have societal uh, connotations, but um, from what I understand now, Kierkegaard also is more interested in that kind of a personal religious experience. And I think the problem in today's world is that that doesn't really help us resolve some of the most important challenges that we face as humanity. Because it's one thing, yeah. I mean, yeah, if you could live by yourself and not be sort of touched by what is happening in the world, then you could choose your own personal belief system and your own personal virtuousness and live in some sense happily with that. But I think that is not today's reality, and I think where the world has radically changed, even from the times of Kierkegaard, is that we have become an interdependent global entity where it's impossible, even in the most, and maybe especially in the most sort of pragmatic sense, for any individual or group of people to experience a good life if they do not coordinate with everybody else in the world. And I think this is the issue where I think we need to find some sort of. And I'm also thinking of the great philosophers who recently left us, Jürgen Habermas, and his concept of communicative rationality. I know I think he was one of those people who tried to find a way where we could somehow find a way to agree on what is the truth, what is right to do. Um, so I think there's this. I think in religion there is this tension between this sort of a personal relationship with divinity, and in the Christian context, definitely this sense of being saved or something like that, and the more social and collectivist aspect of what a good life or what being a human being altogether implies.
I don't know if this is quoted in context, but I think it was Heidegger who said, "Only a God can save us now," and it makes me think about what's the requirement of the present hour for humanity not to destroy itself in some way, because we're headed in that direction. And maybe just pragmatically, we need to have some reference point outside of ourselves. We need to have some collective belief in a higher power, say. And maybe that's what ultimately can provide the glue that can unite us. Whereas if our spiritual center is as the mystics have always had it, kind of within, maybe that's not a good and as wonderful as that is for the individual and as spiritually enlightening as it is for the individual. Perhaps it's not what humanity needs right now, which is a sense that there is some moral order out there independent of my own personal relationship. And again, I'm not accusing Kierkegaard of being as you've corrected already, that he wasn't just an individualist in these things, but
well, I think as a moral realist, Kierkegaard could agree that you need some kind of objective standard, some independent standard, right? And it's not just about practicalities. It's not just about how we live, but we're also discussing independent standards for belief, right? And so those are separate issues and should not be confused. I would also add that there is no such thing as religious experience or the concept of it in Kierkegaard. This whole language of religious experience is far more modern and recent. So this is something that you get much later, right?
Mm.
And this is a very sort of recent way of describing things that tends to be read into the history of theology, but it's not there. And so there are different ways of accounting for a personal relation to God, but it need not be a specific religious experience. The pietists, though, were concerned with a personal conversion, but Kierkegaard didn't see that as necessary for being a Christian. He denied that you need to have a specific hour where you were sort of saved or where you sort of became a Christian believer. So Kierkegaard didn't believe in that, really. So he sort of rejected that part of pietism, which was widespread in continental Europe and Scandinavia. Yeah.
Could I just, I know that time is running, and I just want to go back to one of what you have been telling us about this, that you could actually, in some interpretation of Kierkegaard, you could say that by doing good,
yeah,
it means that you actually have faith, even though you say that you don't have.
Yeah.
And but then we also, based on the discussion Cameron and Stephen have started, and maybe we could connect it to the discussion now about the Pope and Trump, because then of course the opposite would be that by doing bad means that you actually don't have a faith, even though you yourself believe that you have.
Well, a bit more complicated, basically. So it would depend, for instance, on whether you need to act under the guise of a good, whether you, by doing something bad or evil, whether that requires that you take it to be good, but you're just mistaken about your subjective views or something similar. So Kierkegaard is very clear that there's asymmetry between the good and evil. And so moral evil requires good, but not the other way around. And so on this kind of view, you cannot escape the good entirely. And this is a sort of realist view where the good has some kind of special standing. And so this is deep metaphysics, and the sort of implications for action theory and for moral psychology is a little bit too much to try to get through in the last seconds. I have a separate paper on this in Inquiry 2023 if you're interested, but yeah. But he's basically rejecting that you can be purely evil. You cannot be entirely demonic or diabolic in the sense that you're only doing evil only because it's evil. Right. So evil requires good, but not the other way around. That's his view.
Okay, so and I had I also comment on Stephen now, or maybe it's for everyone, because I saw that there have been a moon landing for the first time since 1972, and I heard
moon orbiting.
Hmm?
The moon orbiting. They didn't land.
They didn't land, so they were not on the surface. No. I didn't know. I haven't followed that strictly, but I heard an interview with one of the astronauts, the girl, and she was explaining how she had a really like a strong feeling when she came back and watching the globe, watching the Earth as like one whole globe, and just realizing what this means by what we can, that we are actually together. And then I was thinking that maybe we should like send everyone, especially politicians, out into the atmosphere to just to give them this gaze to understand what reality is.
And maybe we could leave them there.
I was thinking about the same, basically. Yeah.
Yeah, but that's why I have this background picture, because it represents that view of the earth.
So good. So shall we end on that note, or yeah? Yeah.
We could go. So thank you, Roe, for being together with us today, and I'm really happy to have learned more about Kierkegaard. And of course, I still believe that there is, if you like, been a little bit interested of what we have been talking about, I recommend really to read him original. Do you have a book? Like what would you recommend to read if you should start someplace in
Okay,
Kierkegaard?
so let's see. Here is one book out on Cambridge. So the paperback came in 2023. This is a book by me. There's
and of course, this podcast, Roe, is not going to have videos. So you have to
okay, sorry. Okay.
You have to mention the name of the book, and this is your book, what you have written on him.
So the book is Kierkegaard on Self, Ethics and Religion. It's out on Cambridge, and there will be a new book in about 12 weeks. It's a Cambridge Element, which is far shorter and a bit easier to read, and that one will be on the ethical and the religious, and also on how you might have moral reasons for believing.
And of course, I will give some more information written on our webpage about the episode that the listener can check out. But if you should recommend one book of Kierkegaard.
Yeah, well, which one? No, so I always liked The Fear and Trembling because it's so provocative, and it's not just about sort of sacrificing your son. It's about how faith can sort of overcome vulnerability, or deal with it at least, and tackle it. So I like Fear and Trembling. It's very stimulating and provocative, and it's not very straightforward. So you can puzzle you for years and years to come. And it's so it's a good one, and there's a lot of literature in it. So one of his crazy things is that one of Kierkegaard's contemporaries, one of his old friends from his study days, actually wrote a whole book that criticized Fear and Trembling, and Kierkegaard read it and commented on this, and this went undiscovered for more than a century, and still to this day it's not very well known. So there is actually to be found a sort of a reply to critics, it's not easily available though. So the whole thing is a shame, basically. Yeah.
Okay, so thank you so much, Roe, and to the listeners.
Thank you. Many thanks.
Yes, thank you for listening also on this episode of the Athens and Jerusalem podcast. You have been listening to Athens and Jerusalem, created by Cameron Namdar, Stephen Phelps, and Knut Ove Esøy. Nora Juel is the broadcast voice and technical support. Music is pieces of Edvard Grieg's Morning Mood. The voices in the intro are Viktor Frankl, interview with Robert Oppenheimer, and Pope John Paul II. Thank you for listening, and please check out another episode.